The corrupt college dean looked me right in the eyes and smiled a sick, evil smile as he officially expelled me from school just to protect a spoiled billionaire's son who had completely destroyed a multi-million-dollar science laboratory. He threw my scholarship papers straight into the garbage can, laughed in my face, and told me that I was just a worthless, broke kid from the wrong side of the tracks, meaning nobody in the real world would ever believe my side of the story. But that arrogant, greedy old man had absolutely no idea that I was the lead student administrator for the entire campus IT network, and I already had all of his dirty, illegal financial secrets downloaded onto an encrypted flash drive sitting right inside my pocket. Let me take you back to the very beginning of this absolute nightmare so you can understand exactly how I managed to single-handedly destroy the most prestigious, expensive, and corrupt private college in the entire state. For 3 incredibly long, exhausting years, I worked my fingers to the absolute bone to keep my full academic scholarship at Oakridge University. Oakridge wasn't just a normal college. It was a massive, highly exclusive playground for the children of politicians, famous actors, and ruthless Wall Street billionaires. The parking lot was constantly filled with brand new sports cars, and the students wore watches that cost more than my entire house. I didn't belong in their rich, plastic world, but I was a total genius when it came to computers and network security, which is exactly how I earned my free ride. Because I needed extra money to pay for my food and my cheap off-campus apartment, I also worked 40 hours a week as the highest-level assistant in the university's main server room. I had master security clearance, meaning I could see every single email, every hidden bank transfer, and every dirty secret the administration tried to hide behind their massive firewalls. For a long time, I just kept my head down, did my homework, and stayed completely out of everyone's way. But everything changed during my senior year when I was forced to become the lab partner of a guy named Trent Vanguard. Trent was the absolute worst kind of human being you could possibly imagine. He was a loud, arrogant, completely brainless bully whose father just happened to be the single biggest financial donor to the entire university. Trent never went to class. He paid other desperate students to take his final exams, and he spent every single weekend completely trashing his expensive off-campus mansion. The university professors were absolutely terrified of his father's money, so they always gave Trent perfect grades no matter what he did. One night, we were supposed to be working on a massive final project in the new, state-of-the-art chemistry lab. I was working quietly in the corner, trying to finish the assignment, when Trent walked into the lab completely intoxicated, holding a bottle of expensive whiskey and laughing with 2 of his rich, obnoxious friends. I told him to leave because he was going to mess up the delicate chemical experiments I had been setting up all week. Instead of listening, Trent thought it would be incredibly funny to start throwing heavy glass beakers across the room. He was trying to show off for his friends, acting like an absolute clown, completely ignoring my warnings. Within 5 minutes, he accidentally knocked over a massive row of highly volatile, extremely expensive chemical compounds directly onto the main electrical server box that powered the entire science building. The chemicals instantly sparked, caught fire, and caused a massive chain reaction that completely melted the entire control panel. The fire alarms started screaming. The emergency sprinkler system flooded the entire laboratory with freezing cold water, and millions of dollars worth of rare academic equipment was completely, irreversibly destroyed in the blink of an eye. Trent and his friends immediately ran out the back door like cowards, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the flooded, smoking laboratory, just as the campus security guards burst through the front doors. I wasn't worried at first, because I knew there were security cameras in the hallway that would prove exactly who started the fire. But the very next morning, I was violently dragged out of my dorm room by the campus police and thrown into the dean's expensive, mahogany-paneled office. Trent was already sitting there, wearing a fake, innocent expression, crying fake crocodile tears, and pointing his finger directly at me. The dean, a greedy, corrupt man named Dr. Harrison, didn't even let me speak. He slammed his hands on the desk and loudly declared that I was a dangerous, unstable scholarship student who had intentionally destroyed the lab out of pure jealousy. When I demanded that they check the security camera footage to prove Trent was the one who did it, Dean Harrison just smiled that evil smile and told me the cameras were magically broken last night. Right then and there, I realized exactly what was happening. Trent's billionaire father had obviously made a massive, secret cash donation to the school that morning to make the problem go away, and the administration had chosen to sacrifice me to protect their precious bank account. They stripped me of my scholarship, permanently blacklisted my academic record so I could never transfer to another college, and gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my bags and get off their campus. As the security guards marched me to the front gates like a common criminal, Trent actually stood by his bright red sports car and laughed out loud, calling me a pathetic loser. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't try to fight him. I just touched the small, metal flash drive resting safely in my pocket, completely loaded with the dean's illegal bribery records from the main server. They thought they had just ruined my life, but they had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on their entire corrupt empire. I walked off that expensive, perfectly manicured campus with nothing but a cheap backpack on my shoulders, but my backpack felt incredibly heavy because it contained the digital execution orders for the entire corrupt university. I didn't waste any time crying or feeling sorry for myself as I took the long, bumpy public bus ride back to my tiny, rundown off-campus apartment on the bad side of town. The moment I walked through my front door, I locked the deadbolt, closed all the cheap plastic blinds over my windows, and sat down at my massive, custom-built computer desk. This computer was the only expensive thing I owned, built entirely from scrapped server parts I had fixed myself, and it was about to become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. I pulled the small, silver flash drive out of my pocket, plugged it directly into my secure motherboard, and instantly bypassed all the basic encryption codes I had originally helped the university set up. You see, when you treat the campus IT guy like invisible garbage, you tend to forget that he holds the absolute master keys to your entire digital life. Over the last year, while I was fixing jammed printers and updating email servers for the lazy administration staff, I noticed massive, glowing red flags hidden deep inside the university's financial network. I started quietly archiving everything in a hidden, untraceable shadow folder that nobody else even knew existed. Now, sitting in the dark glow of my computer monitors, I opened that folder and stared at the absolute goldmine of disgusting, illegal corruption. Dean Harrison wasn't just taking a few bribes here and there. He was running a massive, multi-million-dollar criminal operation from behind his fancy mahogany desk. I opened a folder labeled Admissions and found hundreds of private email chains between the dean and some of the richest parents in the country. There was crystal clear, undeniable proof that the university was intentionally rejecting brilliant, hardworking scholarship students just to make room for the incredibly stupid children of wealthy politicians and billionaire CEOs. The parents were donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to fake university charity funds, and in exchange, the dean was magically changing their children's terrible test scores into perfect A+. But the absolute best piece of evidence, the golden ticket for my entire revenge plan, was a freshly sent email string from that exact same morning. It was an urgent, highly confidential message from Trent Vanguard's billionaire father directly to Dean Harrison's private account. The email explicitly thanked the dean for handling the unfortunate laboratory fire situation so quickly, and it included a digital wire transfer receipt for exactly $2 million, routed straight into a secret offshore bank account that the dean personally controlled. They had literally put a price tag on my entire future, and it was exactly $2 million. Now, a normal, angry college kid might have just taken these files straight to the local police station or handed them over to a news reporter. But I knew exactly how the real world worked. If I just handed over the flash drive, Trent's father would hire an army of incredibly expensive corporate lawyers to bury the evidence, drag the case out for years, and eventually make me look like a crazy, lying hacker. I needed a trap that was completely automated, absolutely unstoppable, and highly public, so the lawyers wouldn't have a single second to react before the entire world saw the truth. I opened up a blank coding program on my computer and started furiously typing, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard for 12 hours straight without taking a single break. I wasn't just writing a simple email. I was building a highly aggressive, self-replicating digital worm specifically designed to infiltrate and completely hijack the university's entire communication grid. I programmed the worm to bypass all of the external firewalls by disguising itself as an urgent, mandatory system update sent directly from the dean's own computer. I attached the massive folder of illegal bank transfers, fake grades, and the secret $2 million bribe receipt directly to the hidden code. But the most important part of my plan was the timing. I knew that the absolute biggest, most important event of the entire school year was happening that very weekend. It was the annual Oakridge Alumni Gala, a massive, incredibly expensive dinner where the dean begged all the rich graduates and billionaire parents for even more donation money. The event was going to be filled with news reporters, local politicians, and every single corrupt person who had ever paid the school a bribe. I set the digital timer on my massive computer virus to launch exactly on Saturday night. Right at the exact moment, Dean Harrison was scheduled to stand on the grand stage and give his big speech about honesty, integrity, and academic excellence. I pressed the final enter key, engaged the automated countdown protocol, and leaned back in my cheap desk chair as a massive, dark smile spread across my face. The bomb was officially planted directly under their expensive leather chairs. The timer was ticking down, and they had absolutely no idea that their entire billion-dollar kingdom was about to be burned completely to the ground by the broke kid they had just kicked to the curb. The annual Oakridge Alumni Gala was the most sickening, hypocritical display of fake wealth and stolen power in the entire state, and it was absolutely the perfect graveyard for their corrupt educational empire. On Saturday night, exactly 48 hours after I was dragged off the campus by the security guards, the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive luxury hotel was completely packed with the absolute worst people on the planet. I was sitting safely in my dark, cramped apartment across town, but I had a perfect front row seat to the entire disgustingly glamorous event because I had already hacked directly into the hotel's high-definition security cameras and the university's official live stream. I watched on my glowing computer monitors as hundreds of billionaire CEOs, corrupt local politicians, and arrogant celebrity parents walked across the long red carpet wearing custom-made designer tuxedos and diamond dresses that literally cost more than my entire life's savings. The grand ballroom looked like a palace built entirely out of dirty money. There were massive, glittering crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings, giant ice sculptures carved to look like the university mascot melting slowly onto the buffet tables, and an army of underpaid waiters walking around carrying heavy silver trays loaded with rare imported caviar and vintage champagne. Right in the middle of all this sickening luxury stood Dean Harrison, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking like an absolute saint as he shook hands and smiled for the flashing cameras. He was acting like the proud, noble father of the university, patting rich alumni on the back and humbly accepting their compliments, completely hiding the fact that he was a ruthless criminal who sold college degrees to the highest bidder in dark rooms. And right next to the massive dessert table, acting like he owned the entire world, was Trent Vanguard. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive, bright white suit, holding a massive crystal glass of champagne, and laughing incredibly loudly with the exact same obnoxious friends who had helped him destroy the science laboratory just a few days ago. I turned up the audio feed on my computer and actually listened to Trent bragging to a group of rich girls about how he got the loser scholarship kid permanently expelled. He literally laughed out loud, boasting about how his billionaire father just wrote a tiny check to make the massive fire completely disappear from his permanent record. Trent's father, Richard Vanguard, was standing just a few feet away, smoking a thick, expensive cigar and casually chatting with the city's mayor, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just illegally bribed a college administrator to ruin an innocent student's entire future. They were all so incredibly comfortable in their shiny bubble of extreme wealth and power. They genuinely believed that they were completely untouchable, that normal laws did not apply to them, and that they could just crush anyone who got in their way like a tiny bug on the sidewalk. But they had absolutely no idea that a massive, unstoppable digital bomb was currently sitting directly underneath their expensive leather shoes, silently counting down the final seconds to their absolute, highly public destruction. On my main computer monitor, a large red digital timer was ticking down without making a single sound. 10 minutes left. 5 minutes left. My hands were perfectly steady as I watched the live stream feed automatically switch to the main stage. The expensive string quartet stopped playing their classical music, and the massive crowd of billionaires slowly took their seats at the beautifully decorated tables, waiting for the main event to start. The bright lights in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed, leaving only a sharp, blinding white spotlight shining directly on the wooden podium at the absolute center of the stage. The crowd erupted into loud, polite applause as Dean Harrison proudly walked up the stairs, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and confidently grabbed the microphone. He looked out over the sea of rich, powerful faces, flashing his fake, perfect teeth, fully prepared to give his famous annual speech about academic integrity, honest hard work, and the incredibly bright future of Oakridge University. He had given this exact same lying speech 100 times before, and every single time, he used it to manipulate these rich parents into writing massive donation checks to fund his lavish lifestyle. I stared intensely at the red timer on my screen. Exactly 60 seconds left until the virus executed its primary override command. I leaned forward in my cheap office chair, took a deep breath, and watched Dean Harrison open his mouth to start telling his disgusting lies to the crowd. He tapped the microphone, smiled broadly, and welcomed everyone to the most successful, honest year in the history of the school. He was completely enjoying the sound of his own voice, completely blind to the fact that it was going to be the absolute worst night of his entire pathetic life. Dean Harrison was halfway through a disgusting lie about how Oakridge University only accepts the most honorable and hardworking students, when the massive high-definition screens behind him suddenly flickered, turned a bright, aggressive blood red, and began screaming the absolute truth to the entire world. The red timer on my computer screen hit 0, and in that exact millisecond, my digital virus tore through the university's firewalls like a hot knife through butter, hijacking every single electronic device in that grand ballroom. The professional, polite atmosphere of the gala didn't just break, it completely exploded into absolute, unmitigated chaos. At first, the dean thought it was just a small technical glitch. He kept smiling and tapping the microphone, trying to laugh it off. But then the audio speakers, the same ones he was using to brag about integrity, suddenly blasted a crystal-clear recording of his own voice at maximum volume. It was the private recording I had made from the server room of him and Trent's father laughing about the $2 million bribe. The entire ballroom went dead silent as the dean's voice boomed over the crowd, saying, "Don't worry, Richard. I'll have the scholarship kid thrown in the trash by morning, and we can call the fire an accident. Just make sure that wire transfer hits my offshore account before the weekend." The dean's face turned from a confident tan to a sickly, ghostly white in less than a second. He frantically started hitting the podium, screaming for the tech crew to shut it down, but I had already locked every single control panel in the building. The massive projectors behind him, which were supposed to show a video of happy students, suddenly started scrolling through a giant, high-speed gallery of the dean's private bank statements, highlighting the millions of dollars stolen from the university's scholarship fund. But I wasn't done yet. My virus reached out and sent a massive emergency alert notification to every single smartphone in the room. Simultaneously, over 500 expensive iPhones and Androids started buzzing and ringing in the pockets of the billionaire guests. When they pulled out their phones, they didn't see a text message. They saw a direct link to a public website I had created, titled The Oakridge Files. On that site, I had uploaded every single fake grade, every rigged admission, and every single disgusting email Trent's father had sent to the dean. I watched through the security camera feed as the rich parents began gasping in horror, looking up at the stage and then down at their phones, realizing that the exclusive education they were paying for was nothing but a criminal scam. Trent Vanguard, who had been laughing and drinking champagne just seconds ago, was now standing in the middle of the room with a look of pure, agonizing terror on his face. He watched as a giant photo of the burnt science lab appeared on the screens, followed by a high-definition video I had recovered from a deleted backup drive. The video showed Trent clearly throwing the beakers, laughing while the lab caught fire, and then running away like a coward. His billionaire father, Richard, tried to stand up and shout for everyone to stop recording, but it was way too late. Every single person in that room was holding up their smartphone, recording the dean's total psychological breakdown on stage. The dean was literally foaming at the mouth, sweating through his $5,000 tuxedo, and clawing at the curtains like a trapped animal. The university's board of trustees, who were sitting at the front VIP table, looked like they wanted to crawl under the furniture and hide. They realized that their entire multi-billion-dollar reputation had just been vaporized in less than 3 minutes. I sat back in my dark apartment, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my eyes, and watched as the first police sirens began to wail in the distance. I had programmed the virus to automatically BCC every single leaked document directly to the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the state's attorney general the exact moment the gala screens went red. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had completely crushed the life out of their corrupt system. The dean finally collapsed onto the stage, dropping the microphone with a loud, ringing thud that echoed through the ballroom, as the front doors were kicked open by a team of grim-faced federal agents. They didn't come to help the dean. They came to arrest him in front of every single person he had ever lied to. I took a slow, deep breath of the stale air in my tiny apartment and felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. They thought they could kick me out and leave me with nothing, but they forgot that in the modern world, the person who controls the data controls the destiny of everyone. The gala wasn't a celebration anymore. It was a televised funeral for the most corrupt college in America, and I was the one who had pulled the plug. The sound of federal agents, heavy boots marching across the polished marble floor of the ballroom, was the final nail in the coffin for the most corrupt administration in the history of the state. While Dean Harrison was still gasping for air on the stage, looking like a fish out of water, the federal agents didn't waste a single second with polite conversation. They moved with military precision, pushing through the crowd of shocked billionaires and surrounding the stage before the dean's private security could even react. The lead agent, a man with a face like cold stone, stepped up to the podium, pushed the dean's shaking hands away from the microphone, and loudly announced that the university was now the center of a massive federal racketeering and bribery investigation. The room, which was usually filled with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and snobby laughter, was now so quiet that you could hear the sweat dripping off the dean's forehead. I watched the entire thing through the high-definition security feed, zooming in on Trent Vanguard's face. For the first time in his entire life, the rich bully looked genuinely terrified. He was looking at his father, Richard Vanguard, silently begging him to do something, to say something, to write another check that would make the FBI disappear. But for once, Richard Vanguard was completely powerless. I had timed the data leak so perfectly that the federal agents were already holding printed copies of the wire transfer receipts that connected the Vanguard family fortune directly to the dean's offshore bank account. Richard tried to step forward, using his usual arrogant, bossy voice to tell the agents that they were making a massive mistake and that he knew the president, but the lead agent didn't even look at him. He simply handed Richard a federal subpoena and told him to sit down and be quiet before he was charged with obstruction of justice in front of the entire city. Back on stage, 2 agents grabbed Dean Harrison by his arms, pulled him up from his knees, and snapped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The sound of that metal clicking shut was broadcasted live through the ballroom speakers for everyone to hear. The dean started crying, begging for mercy, and trying to blame the school's board of trustees, but the agents just marched him off the stage like a common criminal. While the dean was being dragged out, the secondary team of agents moved toward the university's main office with a federal search warrant. Because I had used my virus to lock every single digital door in the building, the administrators couldn't delete a single file or shred a single piece of paper before the agents arrived. Every dirty secret, every rigged grade, and every illegal contract was sitting right there waiting for them on a silver platter. I watched as the agents began carrying out boxes and boxes of evidence, while the rich alumni and parents started running for the exits, desperately trying to hide their faces from the news cameras waiting outside. They knew that their names were on those leaked lists, and they knew that their perfect children were about to be exposed as frauds. Trent tried to sneak out the back door with his friends, but I had already anticipated his move. I had programmed the hotel's smart lock system to trigger a total lockdown on all emergency exits the moment the FBI entered the building. Trent was trapped in the hallway, pounding his fists against the heavy glass doors, screaming like a spoiled toddler who had finally been told no. I sat back in my dark apartment, watching the red and blue police lights reflecting off the windows of the hotel through the street-level cameras. I felt a cold sense of justice wash over me. They had called me a loser, they had called me trash, and they had tried to destroy my future just to save a few dollars in a bank account. But now, the school's stock was plummeting, their reputation was in the trash, and the rich bully was currently sitting on the floor of a hotel hallway, crying because he couldn't get to his red sports car. I picked up my phone and saw that the story was already the #1 trending topic on every social media platform in the country. The Oakridge files had gone viral, and there was no going back. I took a slow sip of water, looked at the remaining files on my screen, and realized that while the dean and the vanguards were finished, there were still a few more people who needed to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you protect a bully. I wasn't just going to bring down the dean. I was going to dismantle every single person who had stood by and watched me get expelled without saying a word. The real cleanup was only just beginning, and I had all the time in the world to make sure they all felt the exact same fear I felt when they threw me out. The system that was designed to protect them was now the very thing that was going to hunt them down, and I was the one holding the leash. The morning sun rose over Oakridge University the next day. But instead of the usual quiet sounds of birds chirping and students walking to early morning classes, the air was filled with the deafening roar of news helicopters and the angry chanting of thousands of students who had finally had enough of the lies. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the campus was a total war zone of public outrage. I was sitting in my apartment, watching 3 different news feeds simultaneously, as the students I used to sit in class with were now tearing down the massive banners featuring Dean Harrison's face and throwing them into a giant bonfire in the middle of the quad. The Oakridge files had spread across the internet like a wildfire fueled by gasoline, and now every single student who had actually worked hard for their grades realized they had been cheated by a system that favored the rich and the corrupt. The Board of Trustees, a group of 15 wealthy men and women who usually spent their time at expensive golf courses, were now trapped inside the main administration building, surrounded by a massive crowd of angry protesters and a heavy line of campus police who looked like they were ready to quit. I had used my final backdoor access to the university's internal phone system to listen in on their emergency conference call, and the sound of their panic was like music to my ears. These powerful people were turning on each other like a pack of starving wolves in a trap. They weren't trying to save the school anymore. They were only trying to figure out how to blame everything on Dean Harrison and the Vanguard family so they could keep their own reputations clean. One of the board members was actually crying on the phone, screaming that her multi-million-dollar tech company would be destroyed if her name stayed connected to the bribery scandal. But while the adults were fighting for their lives in the boardroom, Trent Vanguard was experiencing a whole new kind of hell on the campus he used to rule like a king. Because the federal agents had frozen all of his father's local assets and seized their mansion as part of the investigation, Trent had nowhere to go. He tried to walk into the student union building to get some food, but the moment he stepped through the door, the entire room went dead silent. Every single student stopped talking and stared at him with looks of pure, unadulterated hatred. These were the same people who used to laugh at his jokes and beg to come to his parties. But now that his father's money was gone and his crimes were on every screen in the country, he was radioactive. Someone in the back of the room yelled arsonist, and suddenly the entire building was shouting at him, booing him, and throwing trash in his direction. Trent, the guy who used to walk around with his chest out and a smirk on his face, looked like a small, broken child. He tried to run back to his red sports car, but he found it surrounded by a group of angry scholarship students holding signs that said, "Justice for the Expelled." They had used permanent markers to write "fraud" and "bully" across the expensive leather seats and the hood of the car. He realized in that moment that he couldn't buy his way out of this, and he couldn't bully his way out of it either. His father was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. His lawyers were refusing to pick up his calls because the bank accounts were empty, and the university was legally obligated to move forward with his permanent expulsion to try and save their own skins. I watched through the campus security cameras as the interim dean, a terrified woman who had been promoted just an hour ago, walked out onto the balcony and announced that Trent Vanguard was officially banned from the campus and that his degrees were being completely revoked. The crowd of students erupted into a cheer so loud it shook the windows of the administration building. Trent just stood there in the parking lot, holding his keys to a ruined car, with absolutely nowhere to go and no one to call. He looked directly into one of the security cameras, almost as if he knew I was watching, and I saw the exact moment his spirit finally broke. But the most satisfying part of the day was yet to come. While the school was falling apart, I was busy sending one last, very specific email to the State Board of Education. I didn't just have evidence of the bribery. I had proof that the school had been faking its accreditation data for the last 5 years to keep its top-tier ranking. This was the nuclear option. If the school lost its accreditation, every single degree they had ever issued would become practically worthless in the eyes of major employers and other universities. I was going to make sure that the name Oakridge didn't just mean corrupt. I was going to make it mean garbage. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun hit the monitors, and felt a strange sense of peace. I was still broke. I was still technically expelled, and I was still living in a tiny apartment, but I had successfully dismantled a billion-dollar machine that thought it could crush me. The bully was gone, the dean was in chains, and the board was in a blind panic. But as I looked at the files one more time, I saw a hidden folder I hadn't noticed before, one that contained the names of the private investors who actually funded the university's massive expansion. And that's when I realized that this story was about to get much bigger than just a college campus. The sound of 500 high-priced corporate lawyers slamming their briefcases onto the marble tables of the university lobby was 1,000 times louder than the fire that destroyed the lab. And it was the exact moment the Board of Trustees realized they were finally going to pay for every single lie they ever told. Losing a college's accreditation is like telling a billionaire that the gold bars in his safe are actually made of cheap plastic. The second the State Board of Education officially announced that Oakridge University was being investigated for data fraud and was losing its top-tier ranking, the entire world shifted for the rich parents of the students. Suddenly, the $300,000 they had paid for their children's degrees became absolutely worthless. A degree from Oakridge was no longer a golden ticket to a high-paying job on Wall Street. It was now a giant, red flag of corruption that would get their resumes thrown in the trash immediately. I was sitting in my dark apartment, watching the street cameras outside the administration building, and it looked like a scene from a movie. A massive line of black SUVs and luxury sedans was stretched for blocks around the campus. The rich parents weren't coming to donate money this time. They were coming with blood in their eyes. I watched through the security feed as the mothers and fathers of the spoiled bullies I used to go to class with marched into the lobby, screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding to see the Board of Trustees right this second. They weren't just angry. They were terrified that their own reputations were going to be dragged down with the school. I had used my digital worm to send a very specific, anonymous tip to every single parent on the university's mailing list, showing them exactly how Dean Harrison had used their donation money to pay for his secret offshore accounts instead of fixing the school's facilities. I gave them the names of the board members who had known about the bribery for years and had done absolutely nothing to stop it. The lobby was filled with the sound of wealthy people yelling about class action lawsuits and criminal negligence. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of the rich turning on the rich. But while the parents were busy screaming in the lobby, I was focused on the hidden folder I had found in the university's deepest server files. The folder was titled The Founder's Circle, and it contained the names of the 5 private investors who actually owned the land the university was built on. This was the biggest secret of all. Oakridge wasn't just a school, it was a massive real estate play. These 5 investors were some of the most powerful people in the country, and they were using the university as a front to avoid paying millions of dollars in property taxes. If the school completely collapsed and shut down, these investors stood to lose over $500 million in tax breaks and real estate value. As I scrolled through the names, my heart stopped. One of the primary investors was actually Trent Vanguard's grandfather, the man who had built the entire family fortune. This meant that the Vanguards weren't just students. They were the secret owners of the entire corrupt system. I realized that my plan hadn't just hit the dean. It had hit the very foundation of the Vanguard family's power. I saw a secret, encrypted message sent from the grandfather to the board of trustees that morning, telling them to liquidate the assets and burn the evidence before the federal agents could find the real estate contracts. They were planning to burn down the entire university's history just to save their own money. But they forgot one very important thing. I was still the one who controlled the digital archives. I spent the next 6 hours writing a new script that would prevent anyone from deleting a single byte of data from the servers, even if they tried to physically smash the hard drives. I was locking them inside a burning building with no way to hide the truth. Meanwhile, on the campus quad, the situation was getting even worse for Trent. He had tried to hide in his dorm room, but a group of angry students had found out that his family were the secret owners of the school. They were outside his window, chanting, "Give the money back," and "Rich kids go home." Trent was trapped inside, crying on the floor of his luxury dorm room, realized that his father's money couldn't buy a single friend in the entire world. He tried to call his grandfather, but the old man had already disconnected his phone to avoid the FBI. Trent was officially on his own, and the reality of his life as a rich bully was officially over. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the caffeine hit my system, and looked at the clock. It was time for the final move. I wasn't just going to leak more files. I was going to contact the 5 investors directly and give them an ultimatum. I had the proof that they had been using the school for illegal tax evasion for 30 years. I had the signatures, the bank routes, and the private contracts. I was going to tell them that if they didn't officially sign over the deed of the university land to a public trust that would protect the students' futures, I would send every single file to the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. I was done being the victim. I was now the one holding the keys to the entire kingdom, and I was going to make sure that the people who tried to steal my future would never be able to buy another one ever again. I pressed the send button on the first email to the grandfather, sat back in my chair, and watched the status bar turn green. The war was in its final stage, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what it felt like to have all the power in the world. The private, encrypted burner phone on my desk started vibrating so hard it almost fell off the edge, and when I saw the caller ID was from a restricted, high-security government-grade line, I knew the billionaire grandfather of the year was finally calling to beg for his life. This wasn't Trent's father, who was currently crying in a jail cell, and it wasn't the corrupt dean, who was probably already talking to federal investigators to save himself. This was the big boss, the man behind the curtain, the legendary Richard Vanguard Sr., the man who had spent 50 years building a massive, cold-blooded empire on a foundation of lies, bribes, and stolen land. I took a slow, deep breath, waited for the phone to ring 5 more times just to let him sweat, and then I finally swiped the screen to answer. I didn't say a single word. I just sat there in the quiet of my dark apartment, listening to the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who realized his entire legacy was about to be turned into a pile of ash. "How much do you want?" he finally growled, his voice sounding old, tired, and full of a fake authority that didn't work on me anymore. He didn't ask who I was, and he didn't try to deny the crimes, because he knew that I was currently holding a digital gun to the head of his entire $500 million real estate empire. "I can have $10 million moved into any account in the world for you by midnight tonight," he continued, his voice shaking just a little bit. "You can leave the country, go to a private island, and live like a king for the rest of your life. All you have to do is delete those Founders Circle files and give me the master decryption keys to the university servers. You're a smart kid, so don't be a hero. Take the money and run before I decide to make this messy." I actually leaned back in my chair and laughed out loud, and the sound of my laughter through the phone seemed to terrify him more than a death threat ever could. I told him very simply that he didn't have enough money in all of his offshore accounts to buy back the future he tried to steal from me. I told him that while he was busy trying to buy my silence, I was currently watching the live GPS trackers on the 3 black SUVs he had sent to find my apartment building. I had already hacked into the city's traffic light system, and the SUVs were currently stuck in a massive, artificial traffic jam 3 miles away from my location. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, and I could practically feel the cold sweat pouring down the old man's face. He realized in that exact second that he wasn't dealing with a normal college student. He was dealing with a digital ghost who was 5 steps ahead of him in every direction. I started listing off the exact numbers I had found in his secret files: the 30 years of property tax evasion, the illegal land transfers, and the secret contracts that proved he had been using Oakridge University as a massive money laundering machine to fund his family's luxury lifestyle. Every time I mentioned a new illegal bank route or a fake company name, I could hear him gasping for air like he was having a heart attack. He tried to switch tactics, suddenly acting like a kind, concerned grandfather, telling me that his grandson Trent was just a young, stupid boy who made a mistake, and that I shouldn't ruin the whole family because of one kid's bad choice. That was the moment I finally lost my patience. I screamed into the phone, telling him that Trent didn't just make a mistake. He intentionally burned down a multi-million-dollar lab, lied about it to my face, and watched with a smile while the dean destroyed my entire academic career just to protect his spoiled ego. I told the grandfather that Trent wasn't the problem anymore. The problem was the entire corrupt system they had built, and I was the one who was going to tear it down brick by brick. I told him that I had already programmed my digital worm to send the Founders Circle files to the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice in exactly 60 minutes, unless he did exactly what I said. I demanded that he immediately sign a legally binding document, witnessed by my own private team of legal consultants I had contacted through a pro bono justice group, turning the entire university land over to a public trust that would be managed by the students and the city. I told him he had to surrender all of his voting rights on the board, and that he had to personally pay for the reconstruction of the science lab out of his own private pocket, with 0 tax deductions. The grandfather started screaming, calling me a crazy brat, and swearing that he would spend every penny he had to see me in prison. But I just calmly pointed out that if he didn't sign the papers, he wouldn't have any pennies left to spend. He would be sitting in the same jail cell as his son, and his grandson Trent would be out on the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. While we were talking, I had the camera feed of Trent's dorm room open on my second monitor. Trent was currently on his knees, crying into his silk pillow, while campus security stood outside his door waiting to escort him off the property for good. I told the grandfather to look at his own security cameras and see his precious legacy falling apart in real time. The old man finally broke. He stopped screaming and started begging, his voice cracking like a dry leaf. He realized that the scholarship kid he had ignored for years was now the absolute dictator of his family's future. He agreed to meet my lawyers and sign the documents, but I told him there would be no meeting. I had already sent the digital contracts to his secure email, and he had 45 minutes left on the clock before the send button on my server triggered the end of his world. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, watched the status bar on my computer as the old man frantically opened the email, and felt a massive sense of power. They thought they could use their money to make the world whatever they wanted it to be, but they forgot that the world is built on data now, and I was the one who held the master password. The final countdown had started, and the billionaire's empire was officially on life support. The digital signature of the most powerful billionaire in the state hit my inbox with a quiet, tiny notification sound that echoed through my dark apartment like a massive explosion, signaling the absolute and total end of the Vanguard family's reign of terror. I stared at the computer screen, watching the legally binding metadata confirm that Richard Vanguard Sr. had officially signed over the deed to the university land and surrendered all of his voting rights to a public trust. He had chosen to save his own skin and stay out of a federal prison cell by sacrificing the school, the board, and his own grandson's future. It was a cold, calculated move by a desperate old man, but it was exactly what I needed to finish the job. I didn't waste a single second celebrating. I immediately forwarded the signed documents to the federal investigators and the city's legal department, making sure the transfer was irreversible and public before the old man's lawyers could try to find a loophole. Then, I turned my attention back to the live security camera feed of Trent's luxury dorm room. The 45-minute timer I had set on the grandfather's life was now at 0, and it was time for the final physical eviction. Trent was still sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by piles of expensive designer sneakers and high-end electronics, frantically trying to pack a suitcase while crying so hard he was actually hyperventilating. He looked like a frightened little kid who had just realized that his daddy's black credit card was nothing but a useless piece of plastic now. Suddenly, there was a loud, aggressive pounding on his heavy oak door. 2 campus security guards, the exact same men who had helped drag me off the campus just a few days ago, didn't even wait for Trent to open the door. They used their master key, swung the door open with a loud thud, and marched into the room with their hands on their belts. They didn't treat him like a VIP anymore, they didn't call him sir, and they didn't offer to help him with his bags. The lead guard, a man who had once laughed at Trent's jokes just to get a tip, looked at him with pure disgust and told him he had exactly 60 seconds to get out of the building before he was arrested for criminal trespassing on public trust property. Trent started screaming and crying, begging them to let him stay just one more night, offering them his expensive gold watch just to leave him alone. The guard didn't even look at the watch. He just grabbed Trent by the back of his expensive designer jacket, pulled him up to his feet, and started dragging him toward the hallway. I watched through the hallway cameras as the rich bully was forced to walk the longest, most humiliating journey of his life. He was barefoot, wearing wrinkled silk pajamas, and carrying nothing but a single, cheap black garbage bag filled with whatever he could grab in a panic. As they reached the main lobby of the dorm building, word had already spread across the campus like a wildfire. Hundreds of students had gathered outside the dorm entrance, forming a massive, silent tunnel of people waiting to watch the fall of the king. The security guards pushed the heavy glass doors open and practically threw Trent out onto the concrete steps. The silence of the crowd was deafening for about 3 seconds, and then the entire quad erupted into a massive, thunderous roar of boos and insults. Students were holding up their phones, recording every second of Trent's tear-stained face and his bare feet on the cold ground. Someone yelled, "How does it feel to be trash, Trent?" And the crowd started chanting "Justice for the Expelled," over and over again until the sound echoed off the surrounding buildings. Trent tried to hide his face with his garbage bag, stumbling down the stairs, but he had nowhere to run. His red sports car was already being towed away by a heavy-duty truck because the lease payments had been officially canceled by the bank. He had to walk right through the middle of the crowd, the very people he had spent years bullying and looking down on, and every single one of them was laughing at him. He was a pariah, a joke, and a failure, all in the span of one weekend. While Trent was suffering through his walk of shame, I initiated the final phase of my digital takeover. I bypassed the university's main website homepage and replaced it with a giant, scrolling list of every single student who had been unfairly expelled or rejected over the last 10 years to make room for the rich frauds. I posted the link to the new public trust application, showing that the school was now officially owned by the city and would be tuition-free for anyone who met the actual academic requirements. The board members, who were still trapped in the administration building, found out about the land transfer the same way everyone else did, by reading it on the news. I watched as they started running for the back exits, trying to avoid the cameras, but the federal agents were already waiting at every door to hand them their own subpoenas. I sat back in my chair, the morning sun finally starting to fill my tiny apartment, and watched the live feed of the students celebrate on the quad. They were tearing down the Oakridge signs and replacing them with a banner that simply said, "The People's University." I pulled the small silver flash drive out of my computer, the one that had started this entire war, and looked at it in my hand. It was just a tiny piece of metal and plastic, but it had successfully dismantled a 50-year-old empire built on corruption. I felt a strange sense of emptiness, but also an incredible, overwhelming sense of peace. I was still a kid in a rundown apartment, but I was the kid who had won. I opened my window, breathed in the fresh morning air, and watched as the news helicopters finally flew away, leaving the campus to the students who actually deserved to be there. The bully was gone, the money was gone, and for the first time in history, the truth was the only thing left standing. I knew that my journey was just beginning, but as I looked at the news reports showing Trent sitting on a public bus with his garbage bag, I knew that the meal of revenge had been served perfectly, and it was worth every single second of the struggle. Walking back through the massive iron gates of the university exactly 7 days after being dragged out like a common criminal felt like stepping into an entirely different universe, where the laws of gravity had finally started working in favor of the truth. I wasn't sneaking onto the campus, and I wasn't hiding my face behind a hood anymore. I was riding in the back of a black government SUV, sitting right next to the lead federal investigator who had spent the last week dismantling the dean's illegal bank accounts. As the car drove slowly down the main entrance road, I looked out the tinted window and saw that the world had already started to change for the better. The massive gold-plated sign that used to say Oakridge Private University had been covered with a temporary banner that simply said, "The People's Public Institute." The students were no longer walking around in expensive designer suits and high-heeled shoes, looking down their noses at everyone. Instead, the campus was filled with a diverse crowd of hardworking kids in regular hoodies and jeans, some of whom were the very scholarship students who had been rejected years ago to make room for the rich frauds. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere was electric with hope, and the sound of angry chanting had been replaced by the sound of construction crews already working to repair the damage the Vanguards had caused. We pulled up to the front of the main administration building, the exact same place where Dean Harrison had laughed in my face and told me I was nothing. As I stepped out of the car, a group of student protesters who had stayed on the quad for a week straight instantly recognized me. They didn't start a riot, they started a standing ovation. It was a deafening, overwhelming sound of pure respect that made my eyes sting for the first time since this whole war started. I walked up those marble steps, my head held high, and entered the lobby to find the interim board members waiting for me. They weren't arrogant billionaires this time. They were a group of respected professors, local community leaders, and even one of the janitors who had worked at the school for 30 years. They didn't hand me a tuition bill or a disciplinary notice. They handed me a brand new student identification card and a set of keys to the main server room. But before I could focus on my new life, I had to see the final legal results of the bomb I had dropped. The lead investigator opened a heavy legal folder on the mahogany table and started reading the list of charges that had officially been filed that morning. Dean Harrison was facing 40 years in federal prison for racketeering, bribery, and the embezzlement of over $15 million from the scholarship fund. He had already been stripped of his house, his luxury cars, and his private pension. He was currently sitting in a cold, concrete cell, waiting for a trial that he had absolutely no chance of winning because my digital evidence was so perfect and undeniable. Richard Vanguard, Trent's father, had been hit even harder. The federal government had used the Founders Circle files to seize every single piece of real estate the Vanguard family owned, including their private jet and their offshore vacation homes. The family was officially bankrupt. Their name was a toxic brand that no one would touch, and they were facing a combined total of 80 criminal counts. And then there was Trent. I asked the investigator what had happened to the rich bully who had started this entire nightmare. The investigator pulled a small tablet out of his bag and showed me a grainy surveillance photo taken just 24 hours ago. It showed Trent Vanguard standing behind the counter of a greasy, rundown fast food restaurant on the outskirts of the city, wearing a cheap polyester uniform and a crooked paper hat. He was mopping a dirty floor while a group of teenagers laughed at him. Because his family's money was gone, and his academic record was permanently marked with expulsion for arson and fraud. no other college would take him, and no high-end company would hire him. He was finally learning what it was like to be the trash he used to look down on. He was working 10 hours a day just to pay for a tiny, one-room apartment that smelled like old cooking oil. Seeing that photo didn't make me feel happy, but it did make me feel a deep sense of balance. The system hadn't just punished him, it had forced him to live the reality he had tried to force on everyone else. After the meeting, I walked down to the basement level, directly to the high-security server room where I used to work as an invisible assistant. I swiped my new master key, walked through the heavy steel doors, and felt the familiar cool air of the server racks hitting my face. I sat down at the main terminal, the same one I had used to launch the virus, and began the long process of cleaning up the digital corruption. I started by restoring the grades of every student Trent's father had paid to suppress, and I personally sent out over 500 digital admission invitations to the brilliant kids who had been rejected by the dean's bribery scheme. My final task was the most satisfying of all. I opened the main university financial ledger and officially authorized the release of the $2 million bribe money the FBI had recovered, but I didn't send it back to the Vanguards. I sent it directly to the contractor's account to finish the reconstruction of the new, state-of-the-art Science and Technology Center. The building that Trent had tried to destroy was going to be rebuilt using his own family's stolen money, and it was going to be named after the very first scholarship student who ever graduated from the school, my father. I leaned back in the swivel chair, listening to the steady hum of the servers, and realized that my father's legacy was finally safe. I wasn't just a scholarship kid anymore. I was the architect of a new kind of education, one where your brain mattered more than your bank account. I pulled the small silver flash drive out of my pocket, looked at it one last time, and then dropped it into the secure shredder. The war was over, the truth had won, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at the past. I was looking at a future that I had built with my own two hands. The university was finally a place of learning again, and I was exactly where I belonged. The morning of graduation at the newly renamed People's Public Institute didn't feel like the stuffy, arrogant, and exclusive events of the past. It felt like a massive, sun-drenched festival of freedom and hard-earned justice. As I stood in front of the mirror in my tiny apartment, the same apartment where I had launched a digital war that changed the history of the state, I carefully adjusted the heavy silk collar of my black graduation gown. I wasn't just a student anymore. I was the valedictorian of the most resilient, honest, and hardworking class this campus had ever seen. I looked at the reflection of the young man in the mirror and realized that the dark circles under my eyes weren't from fear or exhaustion anymore, but from the incredible, satisfying weight of building something that actually mattered. I walked through the massive iron gates of the campus one last time as a student, and the sight that met my eyes was enough to make any person believe in the power of karma. The main quad, which used to be filled with snobby kids in designer suits mocking the staff, was now packed with thousands of families from every walk of life. There were parents who had worked 3 jobs just to see their children walk across that stage, and there were students who had been given a second chance after being rejected by the old, corrupt system. I walked toward the massive, newly rebuilt Science and Technology Center, the building that Trent Vanguard had tried to turn into a pile of ash. It was now a masterpiece of glass and steel, glowing in the morning sun, with my father's name carved in deep, elegant letters right above the main entrance. I took my seat at the very front of the graduating class, looking up at the stage where Dean Harrison had once stood and told me I was nothing. The new administration, led by a group of the university's most respected and honest professors, sat proudly behind the podium, and for the first time in 30 years, there wasn't a single billionaire or corrupt politician in sight. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass, expensive flowers, and the undeniable energy of a new beginning. Before I was called up to give my speech, the interim dean leaned into the microphone and gave a final update on the legal proceedings that had captivated the entire country. He announced that Dean Harrison had officially begun his 25-year sentence in a high-security federal prison, and that every single dollar recovered from the Vanguard family's seized assets had been permanently moved into a massive, interest-bearing endowment fund that would provide free tuition for thousands of students for decades to come. The crowd erupted into a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But the most satisfying moment for me happened in total silence. I pulled my phone out of my pocket one last time and checked a private investigator's report I had received that morning. It contained a photo of Trent Vanguard. He wasn't mopping floors anymore. He had been fired from the fast food restaurant for his terrible attitude and was now standing in a long, dusty line at a local government unemployment office, wearing a cheap, stained t-shirt and looking at the ground with a face full of bitter, agonizing regret. He was a man with no degree, no money, no powerful friends, and a name that was cursed by everyone who heard it. He was finally experiencing the absolute, crushing weight of being a nobody in a world that no longer cared about his father's bank account. I put my phone away, took a deep breath, and walked up the steps to the podium as my name was called over the loudspeakers. I looked out over the sea of faces, the thousands of students who had fought for this moment, the families who had sacrificed everything, and the federal agents who had helped me bring the truth to light. I didn't talk about money, and I didn't talk about power. I talked about the power of data, the importance of integrity, and the fact that a single person with a laptop and a sense of justice could dismantle a billion-dollar empire built on lies. I told them that the walls of this university were no longer designed to keep people out, but to welcome the brilliant minds that the world usually ignores. As I finished my speech and threw my cap high into the bright blue sky along with 3,000 other students, I realized that the revenge I had sought wasn't just about destroying the vanguards. It was about creating a world where people like them could never exist again. I walked off that stage not as a victim, and not just as a survivor, but as the architect of a new era. The scholarship kid had officially graduated, and the lesson he taught the world would be remembered for generations. If you have been absolutely gripped by this 11-part epic saga of digital warfare, billionaire corruption, and the ultimate calculated destruction of a spoiled bully's empire, then you are exactly why I share these stories of high-stakes justice. You have watched a worthless scholarship kid dismantle a billion-dollar empire, put a corrupt dean in chains, and force a billionaire bully to face the reality of a life without a silver spoon. This story is a permanent reminder to every bully and every corrupt leader out there that the people you try to crush are often the ones who will eventually tear your kingdom down. If you love long-form, deeply detailed, and incredibly satisfying revenge stories where the good guys finally win by using their brains instead of their fists, then you need to hit that like button right now with everything you've got. Make sure you are subscribed to the Revenge Room and that your bell notifications are turned on, because we have hundreds of more stories of legendary karma waiting to be told. Don't forget to drop a comment below and tell me, what was the most satisfying part of Trent's downfall for you? Was it the fast food uniform, the basement apartment, or the look on his face when the FBI arrived? Share this massive 1-hour video with anyone who thinks that money can buy a way out of the truth. My work here is officially done. The servers are clean, the bullies are in the dirt, and the students have finally taken back their throne. I am the voice of the Revenge Room, and I will see you in the next epic story. Everyone in the city thought the story ended on graduation day when I threw my cap into the air, but the true, cold-blooded justice didn't actually reach its peak until exactly 12 months later, when the legal system finally finished chewing up the Vanguard family and spitting them out into the gutter of history. I was no longer that skinny, tired scholarship kid living in a dark apartment. 1 year later, I was the CEO of my own global cybersecurity firm, standing in the penthouse suite of a glass skyscraper that overlooked the very university I had saved. But today wasn't about business deals or software patches. Today was the final sentencing hearing for the Founders Circle, and I wanted to be there to look Richard Vanguard Sr. right in his dying eyes one last time. I walked into the massive, cold stone federal courthouse wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that cost more than Trent's father used to spend on a month of luxury car leases. The hallway was packed with international news reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning bolts as I walked past them with a calm, focused expression. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of old paper, floor wax, and the palpable, suffocating fear of the men sitting at the defense table. Richard Vanguard Sr. looked like a ghost of the man he used to be. His expensive tan had faded into a sickly, gray paleness. His hair had turned completely white, and his shaking hands couldn't even hold a pen. He was surrounded by a team of 20 lawyers, but even they looked defeated, because they knew that every single digital file I had leaked was a silver bullet that their money couldn't stop. I took my seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution, and waited for the judge to enter. While we waited, I pulled up a private surveillance feed on my encrypted tablet, a feed that showed the current location of Trent Vanguard. While his grandfather was fighting for his life in a federal court, Trent was sitting in a damp, windowless basement apartment in the most dangerous part of the city. He wasn't wearing silk pajamas anymore. He was wearing a dirty, oversized hoodie and eating cold beans out of a tin, because his gas had been shut off for non-payment. He was staring at a cracked television screen, watching the live news coverage of his family's destruction, his eyes red from crying and his spirit completely pulverized. He had tried to apply for a job at a local construction site the week before, but the foreman had recognized his face from the Oakridge files and literally laughed him off the property, telling him that they didn't hire rich kid arsonists. Trent was experiencing a level of social isolation so deep that he hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks. He was a living ghost, trapped in a prison of his own making. Suddenly, the courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff shouted for everyone to rise. Judge Miller, a woman known for her absolute zero-tolerance policy on white-collar crime, took her seat and looked down at the Vanguards with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't waste any time with legal columnist. She spent the next 3 hours reading the final judgments, and every single sentence felt like a massive hammer smashing into the Vanguard legacy. Richard Vanguard Sr. was sentenced to 30 years without the possibility of parole. His entire multi-billion-dollar estate was officially liquidated to pay for the damages to the university and the back taxes he had evaded for decades. The judge even ordered the seizure of the family's private cemetery plots, telling them that they didn't even deserve to be buried in the land they had stolen. When the sentence was read, the old man actually collapsed in his chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of total despair. He looked back at me, his eyes begging for some kind of mercy, but I just sat there with a blank, frozen expression, showing him the same mercy he had shown me when he tried to erase my future. After the hearing, I walked out onto the courthouse steps and was immediately surrounded by a sea of microphones. The reporters were screaming questions, asking how it felt to be the person who brought down the most powerful family in the state. I didn't give them a soundbite about anger or hate. I simply told them that the era of the rich bully was officially over, and that the world now belonged to the people who were willing to work for the truth. But as I was walking toward my car, I saw a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, hiding behind a concrete pillar. It was Trent. He had taken the bus all the way downtown just to watch the sentencing, looking like a homeless person in his tattered clothes. Our eyes met for a split second, and the look of pure, agonizing envy on his face was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. He saw the car I was driving, he saw the respect the federal agents gave me, and he saw the life that he thought he was entitled to by birth, now being lived by the kid he called trash. He didn't yell at me, and he didn't try to fight. He just lowered his head and walked away into the shadows, disappearing into the crowd like he was never there at all. I got into my car, drove back to the university, and spent the afternoon sitting in the new science lab, watching the new generation of scholarship students run experiments on the equipment the Vanguards had paid for. I realized that my revenge wasn't just a single event. It was a permanent, ongoing reality. Every day that I succeeded, and every day that the school thrived, was another day that the Vanguards suffered in their cells and their slums. I had turned their world upside down, and for the first time in my life, the view from the top was absolutely perfect. But I knew there was still one final thing I had to do to ensure that no one like Trent could ever rise again. I opened my laptop and began drafting the blueprint for a national whistleblowing network, a digital shield that would protect students all over the country from the same corruption I had faced. My war at Oakridge was over, but the global revolution of the invisible students was just beginning, and I was going to make sure the bullies of the world never slept peacefully again. The heavy glass windows of my corner office in the city's tallest skyscraper were so clean they felt invisible, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of the world I had fought so hard to reclaim from the ashes of corruption. 5 years had passed since the night the Oakridge Alumni Gala turned into a federal crime scene, and in that time, the world had completely forgotten the names of Dean Harrison and the Vanguard family. But they would never forget the revolution that started in a dark, one-room apartment with a single silver flash drive. I was no longer the broke scholarship kid who had to skip meals to afford bus fare. I was now the founder of the Truth Shield Network, a global nonprofit organization that used high-level blockchain technology to protect academic records and expose financial corruption in universities all over the planet. I stood there, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee, watching the morning fog lift off the city streets, and I realized that true revenge isn't just about destroying your enemies. It's about building a life that is so successful and so meaningful that your enemies become nothing more than a tiny, annoying footnote in your biography. Every single morning, I received a detailed report from my private security team about the status of the people who tried to ruin me. Dean Harrison was currently serving his 5th year in a federal penitentiary, where he was assigned to the laundry detail, spending his days washing the uniforms of the very people he used to look down on. His expensive mahogany desk had been sold at a government auction, and his name had been scrubbed from every building and trophy on the campus. But the report on Trent Vanguard was the most sobering of all. Trent was no longer living in that basement apartment. He had drifted from city to city, unable to hold a job because every time an employer Googled his name, the first thing they saw was the high-definition video of him burning down the lab and crying as he was dragged off campus. Last I heard, he was working as a seasonal laborer in a rural town 1,000 miles away, living in a cramped trailer park and spending his nights drinking cheap beer, staring at the old photos of the red Ferrari he would never drive again. He was a man who had been given everything and ended up with absolutely nothing, while the kid he called trash was now invited to give keynote speeches at the World Economic Forum. I set my coffee cup down and looked at the invitation sitting on my desk for that afternoon. It was the 5-year anniversary of the reopening of the People's Public Institute, and they wanted me to come back to dedicate the final wing of the newly expanded Science and Technology Center. I took my private car down to the campus, and as we pulled through those same iron gates, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. The campus was absolutely beautiful, filled with the sounds of thousands of students from all backgrounds, religions, and income levels, all of whom were there because of their brains and their character, not their parents' bank accounts. I walked up to the podium in front of my father's building, and as I looked out at the sea of eager, brilliant faces, I didn't see victims. I saw the future. I gave a short speech about how the greatest weapon in the world isn't money, and it isn't even technology. It's the simple, unshakable courage to stand up and tell the truth when everyone else is too afraid to speak. I officially opened the new Scholarship for the Silenced, a multi-million-dollar fund that would specifically help students who had been bullied or marginalized by corrupt administrations. As I walked away from the podium, a young girl, probably a freshman, came up to me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for giving her a chance to study when her local college had rejected her for a rich donor's son. In that moment, the revenge was finally, totally complete. I had replaced a house of lies with a fortress of truth. If you have been absolutely gripped by this 11-part epic saga of digital warfare, billionaire corruption, and the ultimate, calculated destruction of a spoiled bully's empire, then you are exactly why I share these stories of high-stakes justice. You have watched a worthless scholarship kid dismantle a billion-dollar empire, put a corrupt dean in chains, and force a billionaire bully to face the reality of a life without a silver spoon. This story is a permanent reminder to every bully and every corrupt leader out there that the people you try to crush are often the ones who will eventually tear your kingdom down. If you love long-form, deeply detailed, and incredibly satisfying revenge stories where the good guys finally win by using their brains instead of their fists, then you need to hit that like button right now with everything you've got. Make sure you are subscribed to the Revenge Room and that your bell notifications are turned on, because we have hundreds of more stories of legendary karma waiting to be told. Don't forget to drop a comment below and tell me, what was the most satisfying part of Trent's downfall for you? Was it the fast food uniform, the basement apartment, or the look on his face when the FBI arrived? Share this massive 1-hour video with anyone who thinks that money can buy a way out of the truth. My work here is officially done. The servers are clean, the bullies are in the dirt, and the students have finally taken back their throne. I am the voice of the revenge room, and I will see you in the next epic story.